This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. President Donald Trump's rapid-fire funding cuts have affected communities from all over the country. Next in line for fiscal year 2026 includes cuts to the National Institute of Health and to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. The Trump administration promises to protect programs like Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, programs that people with disabilities rely on every day. But disability advocates are skeptical. Many individuals in the administration, including Elon Musk, have used troubling language when describing people with disabilities, including the R word. That's according to a report from WBUR. United States Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has expressed a desire to create an autism database using information from Medicare and Medicaid. He's described autism as an epidemic that destroys lives. This is based on reporting from NPR. Today, we're talking about the future of disability services and disability rights under this administration. Joining us today is Tom Kosker. He's a disability advocate at Disability Rights Connecticut. Tom, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much, Catherine.
And also with us is Corey Feasley. Corey is a mentor for the nonprofit organization More Than Walking. He's also a hip-hop artist and host of the Super Adaptables podcast. Corey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Kat, and nice to meet you, Tom.
And also with us is Colin Killick. He's the executive director of the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. Thank you so much, Colin, for joining us as well.
Thank you so much for having me on.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions. We'd love for you to join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Corey, I want to start with you here. Before we get into what we've been hearing from the administration, love to have our listeners to get to know you a little bit more. Could you share some of your story with us?
Sure, yes. Corey Feasley, as you said earlier, I'm a hip-hop artist here in CT. I live here in Bloomfield. I have been paralyzed for the last 20 years. Coming up this June 12th, I was paralyzed in a diving accident, unrelated to my work in the Navy. And I spent, a few months rehabbing and what have you, like before I made my way from Virginia to Connecticut. And shortly after just realizing the change in my life and that it has, the potential to be permanent, I had to figure out, what ways can I now become independent? And being that as a naval veteran or someone who's service connected, I have a lot of resources that have enabled me to do that. And I've gone on to home ownership, becoming a husband, a father of two awesome boys. And I also was just blessed to be able to continue to do music again. And I've been able to release, up to this point, 6 albums. Some of it concentrates on showing people my independence after my spinal cord injury. And I'm hoping that that message can be put out to people alongside of the advocacy work I do here as a peer mentor coordinator for More Than Walking.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Corey. And we're going to dig deeper into all of your experiences throughout this conversation. And Colin, you're with the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. When were you first diagnosed with autism?
Yeah, it's a little bit complicated. I think for a lot of people in our community, is you have this kind of cascade of diagnoses until you have one that fits. So
Sure.
I was diagnosed with dysgraphia as a small child, and then from there went through ADD and executive function disorder and dyspraxia before finally landing on autism in my mid-20s. So, and I think I'm sort of indicative of, there's all this talk about, autism rates have gone up so much. A lot of that, what's actually caused by that is doing a better job of detecting it and a better job of understanding what it is, right? Folks like me getting diagnosed as adults who were missed as kids or who were diagnosed with other things as kids that turned out to be autism.
Well, and as you mentioned, it's sort of a series of experiences before you realize what the diagnosis was. And mentioning that you were diagnosed at 35 or as an adult, what was it like being diagnosed as an adult?
It honestly made some things make most sense. I would recommend neuropsychological testing to anybody, honestly, because it's just fascinating to learn how your brain works.
Mm.
And just going in and realizing that certain kinds of tasks were really easy for me and certain ones were impossible. And that's people have this notion of sort of a purely impairment model. And really, autism is it's different. So your brain works differently. And so finding out that, like, for me, verbal memory, verbal processing tasks were really easy, were really straightforward, even complex ones, whereas visual processing tasks were damn near
Mm.
impossible. And so, like, coming out of it, it's like, okay, now I know, and now I know better both where I excel and where I struggle and how to plan around that.
And this is kind of an obvious question, Colin, but I imagine it's made your life in some ways much easier because you know what to do now.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I know that I'm not gonna, like, be able to look at sort of a complicated visual diagram and understand it. But I can talk, I can ask someone, okay, explain this to me
Right.
in words, and then it'll stick.
And so we've heard Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says that he wants to create this autism database and also calling autism an epidemic. And he's also said how autistic people will never pay taxes, hold a job, or play baseball. And I think it's important, especially as we're having this conversation today, to acknowledge that autism has a wide range of manifestations from being nonverbal to being high functioning. How did you react to his remarks?
Yeah, I mean, it's been upsetting, striking, concerning what you said. So I was actually in the room yesterday at the HHS budget hearing in the Senate where he was being questioned. Um, and I mean, yeah, the language he's used about autistic people is frankly eugenic, right? You know, it's saying that autism destroys children and destroys families, right? You know, that is portraying autistic people as a burden, and it is giving up on us. When you say that someone has been destroyed, what you are saying is they're no longer worth getting any services. It's no longer even worth trying to include them in society. They are gone. They're done with it, as if they were dead. Right. And that
Mm.
kind of rhetoric is incredibly troubling. That kind of rhetoric, in fact, leads to violence against autistic people. Our organization has a day of mourning every year commemorating autistic people who were murdered by family and caregivers. And those are the same kinds of things that people say to justify those actions. Oh, my child had been destroyed, right? This was a mercy killing, whatever, which is a deplorable
Mm.
way of thinking. And it's concerning to hear it coming from him. As far as the registry piece, you know, the announcement initially was so muddled and unclear, and there's been zero communication between HHS and autism organizations essentially since the inauguration. So it was unclear kind of what threat this posed. I think right now, from what they're saying, they're claiming it's going to be voluntary, it's going to be de-identified. I think we have to see about the privacy threat. That may not be so much of a big deal. But the research they want to use this data for seems appalling, right? He yesterday in the hearing mentioned chelation as a possible therapy for autism to be evaluated. Chelation is what you use for heavy metal poisoning. It's literally like ripping heavy metals out of your blood. It's incredibly dangerous if not done very carefully. And it's something that quacks have peddled as a phony autism treatment for years with dangerous results. So if they're going to be using this autism data to make a case for that or to try and build skepticism against vaccines, that's really what's going to do a lot of damage.
Well, and Tom, you've been following this closely, of course, and listening to what Colin and Corey has shared. Anything that you want to respond to, and also thoughts on how did you react when you heard some of the rhetoric coming out from the Trump administration?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. I think I appreciate both your comments and the stuff, the rhetoric, I think, that comes out. It does. It further marginalizes. This community, the disability community, already has been marginalized in so many ways over the years. And to hear that coming from leadership, from people who are in positions of power and, spouting that rhetoric and further marginalizing people with autism and then further all people with disabilities is super troubling, right? We could think back to times when, even in terms of, you talk about some significant things, right? People with autism being murdered or being killed and, right, mercy killing, that sort of things. But just the general abuse and neglect that happens, people with disabilities are abused and neglected at a way, way higher rate than the general population. And this just continues that look and position of people as less than, right, than other, and othering all people with disabilities, including those with autism. And again, the range of supports, the range of things that people with disabilities, that people with autism need, varies widely. To the comment about, they don't play baseball, et cetera. I laugh. I was at a baseball game last night, with a bunch of kids with autism, and we were playing baseball, right? It doesn't look the same as, Major League Baseball, certainly, but we're playing baseball and having a blast. And I would argue that people would get more joy out of watching our baseball game than a Major League Baseball game, to be honest. So, and that they don't work. I work a lot with people who look for employment and gain employment and valuable employment, competitive, integrated, valued employment, and many people with autism are doing that work at various levels. So it's troubling. All of it is very troubling. It just puts us back in the work that we've been working hard to fight against.
And so we've seen the Trump administration make cuts across the board, and they've promised to protect Medicare and Medicaid, which are programs that many people with disabilities rely on a daily basis. But everything is so uncertain right now. Are you concerned, Tom, that we might see cuts into these programs specifically?
Yeah, super concerned. Again, they're talking right now how about they're going to protect the people that need it. And that's what they're saying. Those are the words they're saying. The facts bear out differently. The analysis done by many organizations and professionals based on the current plans has 8 to 10 million people in the U.S. losing Medicaid coverage. Many of those will be people with disabilities. One of the things they talk about is eligibility determinations and redeterminations, and increasing those, being more strict on those. When you do those things, people lose coverage. It's a fact. It's proven by history. When you increase red tape, when you increase those things and make it more difficult to gain coverage, people with disabilities need, and at the same time they're doing those things, they're proposing cuts to services that support people with disabilities, like independent living centers, like our organizations, protection and advocacy organizations, et cetera. So combined with the cuts in services and supports for people with disabilities, the Medicaid cuts, just a couple of stats. 1/3 of kids in Connecticut are on Medicaid, and 2/3 of people with disabilities in Connecticut are on Medicaid. So to say that you're going to make, whatever the numbers are, $700 and $800 billion in cuts federally, it's going to impact people with disabilities in Connecticut. There's so many services that people with disabilities get through different Medicaid waivers, through Department of Social Services. It's administered here in Connecticut, but there's so many waivers that people with autism, people with significant medical challenges, et cetera. So we definitely see a lot of impact in people losing benefits who are the least able to afford to lose those benefits.
When we're talking about people who need the services, I also want to flip it and talk about the people who are providing the services. Can you explain more about how that process is? Because it's also based on a reimbursement rates or processes, right? So how would cuts impact physician services? Will we maybe see fewer doctors accepting Medicare and Medicaid?
Yeah, and we've seen that in the past already, right? So as reimbursement rates get cut, as changes in the way reimbursements are made happen, doctors and providers flee, right? They're not able to provide those services at those rates, and then the number of options for people goes down, right? So then you have very much fewer options of places to go and providers to go to. So, and they're already having a difficult time, seeing the patients they need to see. And there's other changes that they propose. And again, it's really hard to nail down because they talk different things every other day. But, things like block granting the funding instead of the current model, that can be really troubling because then states can kind of do what they want with the money in a way. There's less control over that. There's a bunch of different things that they're looking at doing, all of which are going to be troubling and harm and reduce services for people with disabilities.
Well, especially with what we're talking about, some of the services needed includes home services. So do you think this is something that will be impacted as well?
Yeah, 100%. And to expand on that outside of Medicaid, so the ACL, which is a federal agency, and Administration for Community Living, just to get that right, ACL, they're looking at not cutting but redistributing the programs in there. And what ACL does is they provide supports and services for people with disabilities to live more independent lives, live in the community, including help with caregivers, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that ACL does that as you take that focus away and split these things into different agencies or cut funding to those, that eliminates a lot of these programs and services that help people live independent lives. From, again, I mentioned independent living centers here in the state get federal funding, our P&A system. There's many funding sources that flow through the federal government, including ACL, that help people live more independent lives, obtain housing, find housing, which is a huge problem for many people without disabilities, let alone people with disabilities. It's
Right.
a big challenge.
Well, and Corey, we'd love to get a response from you from what we've heard from Tom and Colin so far, especially since we kicked off the conversations. We're talking about autism, but clearly the ripple effects goes into other people with other disabilities. Any thoughts there?
Yes. I wanted to expand a little bit more on like the comment that RFK made with regard to baseball. There's an entire Olympic event dedicated to people and persons with disabilities and special needs. And they're phenomenal athletes, both uh, people with Down syndrome to individuals who are paralyzed like myself. So they are very appalling to hear and to recognize that even someone can say and concentrate so much on disability, but yet he himself has a disability and he's ascended to a place and a platform where he can make real change. That should speak volumes to everyone instead of it being the other way around. So, focusing on people with autism is great. My oldest son has autism, and he's had access to things like 504 plans, which give him the opportunity when he's overwhelmed or feeling anxious. He can be set aside and able to focus more on his tests or focus more on his work and accomplish those things. And because of that, he's a high honor student. So this notion that people with autism, there's something like totally wrong. Some people just need more resources than others in order to make them successful. That's one. Two, I listened to a doctor in the DMV area, and you guys spoke about policy and Medicare. He said something that was just so profound to me. He said, "I've seen failed policy on my autopsy table." And just recently, there were a number of wheelchair users who were at the Capitol protesting against the cuts in Medicaid because Medicaid is funded to almost $1 trillion. There's no way you can fund these tax cuts without making some type of, cuts into a service that millions of Americans use. And so, as a wheelchair user, I think it's, double fold because you can be a wheelchair user and also have autism, right? So now it's like you have these two things coming at you. So I'm very concerned about what that is going to look like and what it means. I know a lot of the senators on the Republican side, and for us at More Than Walking, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. It just really matters about what you're putting forth. But a lot of them are putting in work requirements and that you need to work, 80% of the time. Well, it's very difficult for individuals with stresses in their life, disabilities, to one, even find employment. Two, the accommodations that may be needed for employment. So with that threat, it makes it a little bit hard and more challenging. And as Tom said, if you change the way that you fund people who are looking for different opportunities with disabilities, you don't give them the access that they truly need. And I think it's more of a danger than what they're really liking on to.
Yeah.
Well,
Catherine, if I could quickly.
Absolutely. I was about to get to you.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out here, like Secretary Kennedy's disgusting comments about autistic people have justifiably gotten a lot of coverage, but it is the entire disability community that is at risk here. These Medicaid cuts will hurt everybody in our community. And it's worth pointing out because of the way that home and community-based services for people with disabilities are funded, right, where these are waiver services, as was pointed out, these are things that are optional for states to cover as opposed to certain core services. These are where cuts would have to happen first if states cut services, right? So we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of cuts. that would directly fall on people with disabilities. And we're talking, to reinforce other panelists' points, we're talking about cutting funding to the agencies that provide those services. We're talking about taking away funding to the critical work that the protection and advocacy organizations do to monitor, to prevent abuse, right? This is our community getting screwed from every side. And it's why you see people in wheelchairs in the Capitol yesterday and the day before getting arrested, even with the draconian way this administration is treating protesters, being willing to take that risk because the threats to our community are that dire. So anybody out there, make sure your members of Congress know how you feel about these cuts.
Today, we're talking about the future of disability services and advocacy. With us is Tom Kosker, who is a disability advocate at Disability Rights Connecticut, Corey Feasley, with More Than Walking coordinator as a mentor, and is also a hip-hop artist and host of Super Adaptable's podcast with More Than Walking. Colin Killick is the executive director of the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, and they'll all be staying with us after the break. Let us know if you have any questions or if you'd like to share your story with us. We would love to hear it. 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
As you journey through the landmines till you land yours, only lions get the conquer roar. You about to get enriched for sure. I'm so wealthy, though so many tears I've poured. Paid your fair share in the unfair world. Still the hero has to die and the villain gets the girl. Find a way, 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 find a way for you.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. 1 in 5 Americans have a disability. That's according to the United States Census Bureau. If you or someone in your family is living with a disability, we would love to hear from you. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. With us today to talk about the future of disability services and advocacy is Tom Kosker, who is a disability advocate at Disability Rights Connecticut, Corey Feasley with More Than Walking, and Colin Killick, who's an executive director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. Ahead of this broadcast, our producer spoke to Emma McKeever and Pam McKeever, who's a daughter and mother from Glastonbury. Emma is a student studying graphic design. She's autistic and shared her thoughts on RFK Jr.'s comments on autism.
I heard about what he said about autistic people, and it's not good. It's actually bad enough that me and my parents felt like we had to make a poem in reaction to it, because one of the things RFK Jr. said was that autistic people couldn't make poems. I don't like any of what he said. It's like, was he trying to mock us? Or did he even fully believe what he himself is saying?
Pam, how have you reacted to this as a parent?
Well, I mean, it's definitely, it feels like it has set all the research back at least a decade, if not more. Just the way RFK Jr. Generalized just characteristics of people with autism, just to, disregard science and kind of pull up old things, I think really has caused a lot of damage. It feels disrespectful, really, at whatever level of severity you're experiencing symptoms, whether you're in the profound range or in the mild range. I think his comments are just wrong. They're incorrect, inaccurate, and disrespectful.
So, Colin, earlier we talked about some individuals with autism require higher levels of support than others, and also mentioning that RFK Jr. has said that autism destroys families. What do you want people to know about what it's like living with autism, and how does that impact your quality of life?
Yeah, I think it's important to know that a lot of people have been saying, "Oh, well, what RFK Jr. said isn't true of all autistic people because not all autistic people have high support needs," and that's true. But what he said isn't true of people with high support needs either, or autistic people with intellectual disabilities either. It's not true because autistic people with high support needs, autistic people who are non-speaking or who have intellectual disabilities, many of them do all the things he said. I love that we had that poem there. I'm a poet myself, but yeah, autistic people do write poems, autistic people do work, autistic people do pay taxes. Not only do autistic people with high support needs date and get married, our organization has actually fought for the ability of autistic people who live in group homes to have romantic relationships if they're adults, which is something that are often prevented from doing because they get treated like children. And it's, people need support with all of those things, right? I mean, I'm certainly at the low support needs end of the spectrum, but I have memory issues. I need this sort of prompting with that. I have, some processing issues, but many people have higher levels of support need, or some people need round the clock care as they do for other disabilities. But autistic people's lives have not been destroyed. And even an autistic person who can't do any of those things that he mentioned, there are some, that doesn't mean their life is not worth living. It doesn't mean their life does not contain joy. It doesn't mean they don't have opinions and preferences. It doesn't mean that they don't have feelings, right? Autistic people are people, and life with autism can be beautiful as well as challenging.
Well, and as you were describing your own life and your thoughts, it reminded me of a saying in the autistic community where if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And so it's not a monolith here in this community. And while life can be hard, is it important for people to know that you do still have community and there are people out there who support each other?
Yes. I mean, really, that's why our organization, Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, exists, right? Is to be that hub for autistic people. We have publications that are like both for academic parents, so you found out your child has autism, but also, so you found out you have autism, right? What does that mean, right? And letting people know, yeah, there's a whole autistic community out there that you can be part of, that will understand you, that will, share some fundamental experiences with you, even though everyone's experience of autism is different. That there are accomplishments to be proud of, there are people to stand beside you, and that our community, firstly, that our community's lives are not just set in stone. The biggest thing that determines the quality of an autistic person's life is not necessarily their inherent medical symptoms, it's what supports and what community they have access to. And we help people find that community, and we help people learn the skills to speak up for themselves and their peers to make sure that those services are accessible.
And so, Tom, the rhetoric that we've been hearing recently, they're certainly not new, but out in the open because of what's been happening recently. Are you seeing this rhetoric impact how the general public views disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say fortunately here in Connecticut, we're in better shape than other places. Mm-hmm. So yes, we're seeing it. Yes, we're seeing people with disabilities being treated poorly, and people feeling more comfortable speaking out against, right, and treating people with disabilities in one way or the other. Fortunately, in my the circles I run in, I tend to be around people that are supportive, right, of people with disabilities. So I see less of that in the world, in my daily world. But what I see in relation to that, in relation to what Colin just said, is, this rhetoric, this way of talking about people with disabilities and people with autism, as we have been moving so far to move people into lives of independence, to lives of more involvement in our community, inclusion in our community. And again, I mentioned ACL as one federal agency that does work in that area, but that's important for so many people, right? To move out of those institutions where many people with disabilities have been in the past. This rhetoric, this conversation, harkens back to those days when institutions were the place to, quote unquote, put people with disabilities, right? And that medical model and that way of looking at them, as opposed to now, which we have many more services. We have Community First Choice, which is another Medicaid waiver service that provides supports for people to move into the community, right? To move out of institutions, out of nursing homes. Group homes can be great and are needed for some folks, but to move out of group homes, to get as much into the community as possible, both in living, in working, in playing, in all of those ways. So I think, again, the rhetoric just pushes us back on those things, as Pam said in her comments. So, yeah.
Well, and Corey, we were just talking about how some of this is not new, and the current administration didn't invent ableism. And you've also spoken about experiencing discrimination since becoming disabled. What has that discrimination looked like? Can you share some of your stories here?
Sure. Yeah. It comes in a myriad of ways. But I wanted to touch on something before I answer that.
Sure.
What Tom and Colin both spoke about is this need for peer support and for community, right? So more than walking, our motto is to share the path to independence after spinal cord injury. And we do that by linking peers who have either similar interests or similar injuries so that they can explain to them, this is how, you may do like your bowel or bladder program. This is how I purchased my first accessible vehicle, or this is the program I had to go through in order to have access to housing. And so many people don't have that. I spoke with a gentleman who is stuck in his home because he can't get a ramp built because he can't afford those things, right? And so in those situations, you get lonely, you get frustrated, you get upset, and you need to have somebody that is similar to you. And like Tom said, he's surrounded by a bunch of people with similar interests and similar disabilities who understand what his child is going through. And that can be overwhelmingly enjoyable. And you know that you're not going through the process alone. So that's one. But as far as, dealing with the discrimination and whatnot, comes in so many different ways. People have a tendency, especially in the beginning of my injury, if I'm being asked a question, they'll direct the conversation to my wife. So they'll say something like, does he want to sit here? Is this more comfortable for him? If we're out to dinner. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like inside my head. But what I love about my wife is that she'll literally pivot towards me and go, no, let me ask him, honey, in a sarcastic way. To illustrate and show to people that, just because I'm in a wheelchair doesn't mean that I'm nonverbal, that I can't communicate my needs and wants. Another area that is problematic is with caregivers. Caregivers tend to come in and want to dictate your care instead of allowing you to lead. And sometimes I think that's an issue of pride. And being that we don't have enough caregivers to support us, especially when we talk about Medicaid being cut and defunded in some ways. If you can't it's already hard enough to keep a caregiver. What's going to happen if I can't pay for them? But yes, that happens very often, and it's extremely frustrating because you just want to scream and say, look, I'm human. I'm still human. I have gotten injured, but my mind is still there. I can still articulate the things that I need. And if you would just give me the chance and be open when you come into my space, into my home to see the person instead of seeing the wheelchair or the disability first, we would have a lot more progress that we have. And maybe we can kind of break down the stigmas that are associated with disability.
And Tom, I think with many people with disabilities, the physical aspect is a big change. The other big change is also realizing that they need to become their own advocates. So they're now self-advocates working to be at the table where decisions about disability policies are being made. So with this current rhetoric that's been going on recently, how do you think that would impact that kind of inclusion?
Yeah, so thinking about advocacy, I got into this advocacy role as a parent. So, my son is 17 years old. When he was born, it kind of got me into this disability world. And I remember actually my wife went to the program first, and then I went afterwards, was a program by our Parent and Training Leadership Institute, CPAC, here in Connecticut, the Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center. and again, federally funded, which is on the chopping block, right? So it's a program that helps train parents. And I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but roundabout, I'm kind of getting there. It's a program that trains parents and gives them the skills, the advocacy skills to advocate for their children. That led me to other advocacy training programs. Partners in Policymaking was one, and there are others. And those things, again, are programs that are funded by, and those build that advocacy network, right? So we need to have a deeper bench, right? A lot of the advocates in our community have been doing this for many years. I mentioned a couple that have been doing it since the 70s. As they get on in age, they can't do it as much as they used to. So we need to keep building that bench and have youth. And then there's youth advocacy programs for youth, kids as self-advocates at CASA, as a group here in Connecticut. And a lot of these are funded indirectly through, in this case, a lot of the Connecticut Council on Developmental Disabilities, which is, again, federally funded and is on the chopping block. So a lot of those programs that are out there and support groups, et cetera, exist because of that federal funding. And with those gone, including my own agency, Disability Rights Connecticut, it makes it really challenging for folks.
And I think with part of the question too is also with the rhetoric that's been happening right now as we're speaking, do you see more or less support for those services, or what are you hearing or seeing there?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely less support. I think, again, it's that othering, right? We talk about the othering of folks, and as you other people with autism, people with disabilities, and you make it okay to talk a certain way about them, then it's okay to take services away, to discriminate against them. So all those things become more accepted. And yes, we're seeing it across the board. The other thing, if I can comment on quick, is discrimination. And Corey spoke about discrimination. A lot of the protections that we have in place and our ability to file complaints about discrimination or have investigations of discrimination occur come through funding. The Office of Civil Rights at the federal level, and there's a number of offices of civil rights. As those get split up, go away, they take away those leaders of those organizations, or they change, that really compromise, one, the ability for people to file discrimination complaints, two, the oversight of our own state agencies and the oversight of other agencies. So, at the same time, and I think as Colin said earlier, they're attacking it from so many different ways that while they're taking away one right and one thing, they're also taking away the support that might help you if that right were taken away. So it's really being attacked from so many angles.
Well,
I'm sorry, I just wanted to jump in.
Yes.
You said something that was key there, Tom. I read something it talked about the percentage of people who have been laid off in the civil rights division.
Huge number.
So you're right. So when you have a complaint of discrimination, you've laid off, I think, to the tune of like 70% of that division. It's going to make it harder for people who have issues with disability discrimination to file those complaints on the federal level. So I just wanted to just add that.
Yeah, go ahead, Colin.
Go ahead. Yeah, example of this, right? The Office of Civil Rights is of the Department of Education, right? Which is there if you file a complaint alleging discrimination against a person with a disability in a public school. These are the people who are ensuring that individual education plans or 504 plans are actually held to. They closed, I think it was 6 regional offices in major cities. There was already a backlog, and now that's going to get dramatically worse. And they're saying, well, they're going to shut down the Department of Education. And they've said, we'll move education OCR under Health and Human Services. But meanwhile, they're slashing Health and Human Services. They've cut employees, I believe, at HHS's own Office of Civil Rights. The idea that you're just going to shift that over and not suffer any consequences is ridiculous. And in fact, to the extent that offices of civil rights are still functioning, in some cases, they've actually weaponized them to go after places for engaging in basic workplace diversity practices, claiming that those are discriminatory, which is absurd.
Quick thoughts here, Tom?
Yeah, it's just so much to say. I'll try to be brief, but on the education stuff and Department of Ed, yes. And moving that to Health and Human Services, they don't have the expertise in that area, right? The Department of Education is the ones that have the education expertise to really oversee, to help. They provide services, they provide training, they provide support from birth to 3, young children in birth to 3 programs, all the way up through high school transition age, through employment. And I just want to give one quick example on Office of Civil Rights is when COVID happened in 2020 and early in 2020, March, April, they helped make sure that hospitals were not discriminating against people with disabilities and not giving them the care they deserved and needed, right? There was rationing of care going on and happening, and people with disabilities were at the bottom of the list, and OCR was there to help step in and make sure that didn't happen. And if they go away, that goes away.
With us today is Tom Kosker, who is with Disability Rights Connecticut, Corey Feasley with More Than Walking, and Colin Killick with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. If you live with a disability, we would love to hear from you. Tell us your experience and what you're thinking about right now. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
Overwhelmed, you steady the helm, chill, gone from being broke, swiping your card still till your grocery cart, bread, eggs, lettuce, and milk, feeling reassured if you're injured, Blue Cross Blue Shield, this anthem, remission of your cancer, so many questions about life, still you living for answers, decisions, get your second wind, and this record is oxygen for your respiratory system, let it just breathe. Falling deep in despair, feeling like you gon' drown, keep coming back up for air and just breathe. Hyperventilating and scared, heart beating outside your chest, believing that death is near, please breathe. Cast away every care, face fear like I ain't going nowhere, and let it just breathe. Breathe, breathe, breathe.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We're living in a moment where funding cuts continue to intensify and the future of federal programs like Medicare and Medicaid are uncertain. The Trump administration's record on disability rights is mixed at best, and U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wants to create an autism database to determine the cause of autism, a plan that's raising alarm bells for the autistic communities and advocates. While Elon Musk, head of the Department of Government Efficiency, regularly uses the R word. This is the context behind the moment the disability community is navigating right now. And we're back with Tom Kosker, Corey Feasley, and Colin Killick. So before we get back to the conversation, I want to share a comment from Maureen, who checked in with us on Facebook. Maureen shared that my youngest daughter collects disability, has Medicaid, and has housing through a nonprofit. She was severely impacted by an early childhood trauma. We adopted her after she witnessed her mother's murder as a toddler. She doesn't have visible signs of disability, but she struggles to process information accurately. Holding a job, managing depression and anxiety, and recognizing her fight, flight, freeze response gets complicated. She can be volatile, reactive, and she struggles with trust and paranoia. Without Medicare, without Medicaid and disability benefits, I'm not sure what will happen to her. Well, thank you so much, Maureen, for sharing your story with us. We appreciate it. And Tom, as I was reading that story, what was going through your head?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of folks in the country, in Connecticut, across the country that are impacted that people just don't think about, right? And so from my son who gets services through Medicaid, and we could probably weather that storm personally as a family, but there are many that can't. And so many of our youth, so many of our fellow citizens with disabilities are impacted and many times are in the shadows, right? So many of our folks with disabilities are in the shadows, living, working, playing, and we need to include them as much as possible. And to hear that story is heartbreaking, but they're getting the support they need now. We need to continue that, right? We need to continue to provide the support that they need to be good contributing members to society and live enjoyable lives, which is, I think, Colin made that quote, like enjoyable lives. Like that's what we're shooting for all of us.
Well, and Colin, you're an active advocate, of course, with the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, which was originally founded in opposition to organizations like Autism Speaks. Can you explain why the opposition and also talk about how you are getting together right now to protect the lives and rights of people with disabilities?
Yeah, that was definitely not, that coming together was not something I expected coming to this job. I mean, I think historically, a lot of rhetoric that Speaks used was the kinds of rhetoric that we've now heard, from RFK in terms of, talking about autism as an epidemic, which we don't think it is, right? The rates have gone up because of better detection, and talking a lot about, impact of autistic, what autistic people can't do, right? Of autism is as very limiting, as which is probably creating a lot of fear around autism. But it's been striking that RFK's rhetoric has been so extreme that even though my organization was founded in direct opposition to Autism Speaks, we actually came together with them, with Autism Society of America, with Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, Autistic People of Color Fund, with the ARC of the United States, a bunch of other disability organizations, to all say together that RFK's comments were wrong, right? That we needed evidence-based autism policy. We needed to not be demeaning the capacities of autistic people. And so that has been a silver lining of this. As much as his comments have been extreme, it has created an unprecedented degree of unity among mainstream autism advocacy organizations saying together, no, this administration's policies are not reflective of what would benefit autistic people. They're not reflective of what the autistic community wants. And we are all, despite our differences, willing to work together to advocate for the needs of this community in this moment.
And Corey, with so much open conversation right now about autism and disabilities, what do you want people and decision makers to understand about living with a physical disability? We've got about a minute here.
Sure. What I need lawmakers, individuals, anybody who's tuning in to understand about we who live with physical disabilities is that we're not incapable of making informed decisions. And when you want to have a conversation with us, just speak directly with us. And also realize that we all have our own individual prejudices. We just don't realize them until, you become disabled or that you are taking care of somebody who is disabled. So look within and recognize where you are actually wrong at. And hopefully that'll help to change your perspective on how you deal with people who physically look different than you. Again, we are human. We have a mind, we are intelligent, and give us the opportunity where we can make changes just like you, because many of us once were on our feet. We didn't all start with a physical disability.
In about 30 seconds here, Tom, quick thoughts on what can we do here with, especially what Corey and Colin just share with us?
Yeah, great question. So I'll just say yesterday we had a call to action. We had over 400 people on a phone call with senators, congresspeople from the state, from the federal government, and advocacy groups, parents, families, individuals with disabilities on the call. We need to do that. We need to continue doing that to raise the voice, to put that message out there. We in Connecticut are fortunate. We have very good support of our federal legislators. But if you know people in states with Republican leaning, call them. Have them do the same thing. Yell, scream out loud, and tell them what the impact is on people with disabilities so that they can move the needle on that. There's help available here in Connecticut, but not across the country. And when these things go away, we need to keep yelling and keep talking.
We'll want to thank our guests today for joining us. You've been listening to Tom Kosker, who is with Disability Rights Connecticut. Tom, appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
You're also listening to Corey Feasley, who's a mentor coordinator with More Than Walking, also a hip-hop artist. You've been hearing his music, and also host of Super Adaptable's podcast with More Than Walking. Thank you so much, Corey, for your time as well.
Thank you for having me.
And Colin Killick, who's the executive director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. Colin, appreciate you sharing your story with us today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.
Fight, unity, strong, together, one, unity, endurance, till the end. We here to win, repeat it again, and you'll find strength. Life, fight, unity, strong, together, one, unity, endurance, till the end. We here to win.